not least because everybody speaks such excellent English. Now, this is a somewhat ambitious lecture because I'm going to try to explain the nature of human civilization. They didn't leave me an awful lot of time, but let's see how far we get. All right, now there's a single overriding question in contemporary philosophy and indeed in contemporary intellectual life. And the question is so big and our answers are so feeble that we do what we can to keep our students from finding out what the question is. But I'm going to tell you what the question is. We now know a lot about how the world works. We have a conception of reality from physics and chemistry, which has acquired a great deal of depth. We even understand the quantum mechanical nature of the chemical bond. I mean, really remarkable intellectual achievements. However, we have a conception of ourselves as human beings, which is difficult to reconcile with the basic facts about how reality is. Reality, according to our best science, consists of mindless, meaningless, physical particles. And indeed, that part that we understand constitutes 4% of reality. About the other 96%, well, that's dark energy and dark matter. And what's dark? What's dark is our knowledge. We're just ignorant. Okay. Now, I'm annoyed at the physicists that they don't get busy and tell me about the other 96%. But anyway, that's their problem. However, the part that we do understand consists of mindless, meaningless physical particles, and we think of ourselves as having consciousness, free will, intentionality, ethics, aesthetics, rationality, political obligations, and all the rest of it. Now, how do we reconcile those two pictures? Now, we have this horrible tradition that says, well, you can't reconcile those two pictures because there's the body over there and the mind over here. That's the worst disaster in our intellectual history, was the dualism. And I'm going to assume that that's mistaken, that we live in one world, and I'm now going to explain how we get human social reality, the reality of money, property, government, marriage, cocktail parties, universities, and summer vacations, how we get all of that out of a world consisting of physical particles. And it's not enough to show how the two are consistent. You've got to show how the social reality is a natural consequence of the underlying basic reality. We have to show not just that a world consisting of physical particles is consistent with a world consisting of institutional realities, but that the institution is a natural consequence of the physical world. So we avoid any kind of dualism. Now, the problem is made a little more pressing by our awareness that we are continuous with orangutans. We have, more than 90% the same DNA as chimpanzees, and yet we think there's something interesting and special about us, and I think that's right. There is a conception of humans which is shared among intellectuals today, but I'm pretty sure it's mistaken, and that is that we consist of chimpanzees plus something else, maybe language or sense of humor or God knows what. But in any case, the idea is you add something to the chimpanzee and you get us. I think it's fundamentally different for reasons that I'm going to explain to you. And I'm going to assume now that we've already shown how mental reality, how consciousness and intentionality are natural biological products of certain kinds of neuronal systems. And I'm assuming that we assume beasts like ourselves who are capable of cooperating with each other. The question is, how then do you get to the reality of money, property, government, marriage, universities, and all of those other social phenomena? And the best way that I know how to answer that question is to explain the development of my own thinking about this, because I made some mistakes early on, but I think they're revealing. I think they're natural mistakes. And if I show how I overcome them, I think that the end theory that I'm going to present you will make more sense. So let's start by asking a simple question. How is it possible that there can be a reality of phenomena that have an objective existence, but they only are what they are because we believe that's what they are? I carry these ridiculous bits of paper around in my wallet, but people find them interesting, you see. And here's an amazing fact. Americans are always amazed by this. You give it to people, and they think it's money. It doesn't look like money, it looks like monopoly money, but they think it's money. And now the question is, what fact makes it money? And the answer is it has to be a fact about human agreement. We all agree it's money. So our question, and in philosophy you have to start with very naive questions. Later on you get very sophisticated, and I never figured out the algorithm from when you stop being dumb and have to be intelligent. But now we're at the dumb stage. The question is, how can this piece of paper be money? And there's no physical fact that makes it money. It's not a feature of the chemistry of the paper or the dyes. So what fact makes it money? All right. Now, that's a general form, or that's a specific form of the general question. How do we create an institutional reality? A reality of institutional facts where you presuppose institutions like money in order that a particular piece of paper can be a piece of currency in the Euro system. And it seemed to me early on that you needed really only three basic notions to get to money. One is you need the notion of collective intentionality. Human beings have a remarkable capacity to cooperate. So you have collective intentionality as your ground floor feature. And I'll just abbreviate things. You have collective intentionality, and then you have this, again, a remarkable capacity that humans have to impose functions on objects where the object requires the function only in virtue of the fact that there has been this imposition of a function on it. So I carry in my pocket various objects. I won't bore you by showing them off, but here's one that the Swiss are very proud of. I always lose these at airports because they take them away from me. Okay, and it does perform its function. It's got a lot of functions, and it performs it in virtue of its physical structure. But now here, and animals also, and birds' nests and beaver dams and so on. There are lots of animals that can impose functions on natural objects. But now human beings have invented something that, as far as I know, only exists among human beings. And that is, humans have invented a class of functions where the function can only be performed in virtue of the fact that the person or object is assigned a special status, and in virtue of the collective acceptance of that status can perform a function that goes with that status. I'm sorry that sentence sounds like German philosophy, but in any case, the idea is supposed to be simple. You impose a function on this object, which is different from the function of the knife. You see, contrast these two objects. The knife performs the function in virtue of its physical structure. This performs the function of being money in virtue of what? There's a collective acceptance that it has a certain status, and with that status goes a function which will only be performed, it will only be accepted in virtue of that collective acceptance. Take away the collective acceptance, and it no longer has the status, and I call those status functions. And as far as I know, we're the only species that has those. So our question then is, how do we get status functions on objects and people? How do we assign these status functions? And how are they maintained? If you require collective intentionality and the imposition of function. And it seemed to me there was a rather simple principle that we apply over and over. And the principle is the principle that underlies what I call constitutive rules, rules that constitute the very activity that they regulate. And that principle is the form of the constitutive rule that says X counts as Y, usually X counts as Y in C. Okay, now I have to take a couple minutes to explain that. We are capable of rule-governed behavior, but again, lots of animals have that as well. But we have invented a class of rules that don't just regulate behavior, but following the rule constitutes the very behavior that the rule regulates. And I call those constitutive rules. So the rule, drive on the right-hand side of the road in Germany or the United States, is a regulative rule. It regulates behavior that exists independently of the rule. But the rules of chess don't just regulate the plan. following at least enough of the rules constitutes playing chess. See, it wasn't the case that a lot of guys were pushing bits of wood around boards, and some genius says, fellas, we got to get some rules, because you keep banging into my knight with your bishop. No, that was not it. The rules of chess don't just regulate, they constitute. And it seemed to me the typical form of constituting rules was X counts as Y, and Z. Such and such counts as a legal knight move. Such and such a position counts as check. Such and such a form of check counts as checkmate. And more importantly, in the United States, getting a majority electoral vote and being sworn in counts as becoming president of the United States. For various boring features of the law in California, I count as a professor in the state of California. So it seemed to me the key to understanding the distinctive human forms of civilization was the rule of the form X counts as Y, which is characteristic of human institutions, and it distinguishes the constituted rules from the regulative rules. Okay, I like that. That seems pretty good, but I'm going to show you some weaknesses of that. But let me first show the power of it. You see, you might say, well, that's kind of feeble. You can't make human civilization into that, just over and over counts as. Well, it has two formal features which give it remarkable power. One is the structure iterates upward indefinitely. So I make these noises through my mouth. They count as the utterance of English sentences. But uttering certain English sentences counts as, for example, making a promise. And making a promise of certain sorts counts as undertaking a legally binding contract. And undertaking certain kinds of contracts counts as getting married. You see what's going on. You have X1 counts as Y1, but Y1 equals X2, and that counts as Y2, and you can keep going upward indefinitely. So you have an iterative power of the structure, which is without limit. I mean, you get exhausted and bored, but I went through, you make these noises, you get married, and of course in the state of California, when you get married, all hell breaks loose, because you get spousal benefits and income tax deductions, and guys now get pregnancy leave. It's slightly ridiculous, but in any case, we have all that in the state of California, and I'm sure you had equivalent things in Germany. Okay, so that's one source of power. The other thing is, these structures don't just iterate up and downward, but they interlap. They are interlapping structures. So, for example, I don't just have money, but I have money in my bank account at the Bank of America on Telegraph Avenue, and it's put there by my employers, the University of California Regents, and I use it to pay my credit card bills and my state and federal income tax and all that kind of stuff. Now, in that last sentence, I uttered almost every noun named an institutional structure. Maybe Telegraph Avenue isn't an institution, but all the rest of it, the City of Berkeley, Bank of America, all of these are systems of constituted rules. And the truth is, you live in a sea of status functions. And those status functions on this theory, without exception, are constituted by representations that have this structure of the constitutive rule. And the examples I've been giving you are typically more or less official. You have money, and you have a university, and you have a bank. But there are all sorts of unofficial constituted rules that also are the structural features of human civilization. So such and such counts as a friendship. And I'll give you some of the defining features of these informal institutions. Or you have friendships and love affairs along with legally binding contracts. So it needn't all be some official, written down constituted rule. There may be just rules that human beings have come to accept. Okay, now that was my initial theory, and I thought it was pretty good. However, there are some problems with it, so let me tell you some problems. Now, I have to take a drink of water, and I want to make sure I'm not going too fast, because I've thought about this stuff before, but you look at me like you're following along pretty well. Okay, so I'll keep going at this kind of speed. All right, there are some problems. First problem is this. Sometimes you set up an institutional fact, a fact that somebody has status function without there being any antecedent rule. So you might just have a group where somebody just emerges as the leader, and they're counted as the leader. So nobody will make a decision without consulting with Sally, or Sally has a special authority in making decisions. Sally is in effect a de facto leader of the group, even though there was no antecedent rule. She just emerged as the leader of the group. Furthermore, there's some interesting cases where you can have a Y status function. You see, the X counts as the Y status function, but you don't have an X. And my favorite example was money, and I would take bits of currency like this. But the fact is, most of your money has no physical existence at all. There are magnetic traces on computer disks in banks that represent the amount of money that you have. But the computer traces, the magnetic traces, are not actually money. They're just numerical values. And when you use a debit card, what you do is you transfer one numerical value from your account to a numerical value of somebody else's account. But there's no physical reality. So oddly enough, most of the money in the world has no physical reality at all. We have physical ways of representing it, but the representations represent the money, even though there's no object or no piece of paper, which is the money. Furthermore, this is quite pervasive. One of the most ingenious of human inventions is the limited liability corporation, where you have enormous power attaching to an entity that is totally abstract. See, you can point to the building and say, well, that's the headquarters of Apple Computer, but that's not Apple Computer. Apple Computer has no physical reality, no geographical reality. It just has headquarters, it has a board of directors and stockholders and plants where they employ people to make the stuff. But the corporation as such has no physical existence. So you have a Y status function without underlying brute X term. What's going on in these cases? And that led me to further reflection, and I should have thought of this when I first worked on this, but you have to ask the question, what kind of a speech act is it anyway when you count something as something else? What kind of a representation is that counting? So now we go into the second part of this talk, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the theory of speech acts. If you ask how many kinds of things can we do with language, well, it seems to me, in fact, there are rather a limited number of kinds in the speech act line of business. Remember, Wittgenstein says, well, we can do countless things. They're unzählige, he says. Well, and then he gives a list. Austin used to sneer at this. People would say, there are infinite number of uses of language, and then they'd give a list of 17. You see, something like that. But it seems to me in the speech act line of business, where we're talking about assertions, statements, questions, command, there are a very limited number of things you can do with language. First of all, you can tell people how things are, and I call those assertives. And now comes a crucial idea. They represent reality, where the task of the speech act is to represent an independently existing world, and that I represent with a downhill arrow. That is the word-to-word direction of fit. That's the words are supposed to fit the world. But of course, as Marx famously reminded us, some utterances are not designed just to represent the world, but to change it. And in the case of directives, the aim of the directive, when I tell you to do something, is to try to get your behavior as part of the world to change, to match the words. You have here the word-to-word direction of fit. So if I predict you will leave the room, that comes out as true or false, depending on whether or not you really do your utterance, your behavior does match my utterance. If I order you to leave the room, that doesn't come out as true or false. It comes out as obeyed or disobeyed, depending on whether or not the directive functions to change reality so that reality in the world matches the words. And a third class are commissives, where I make a promise. I promise to you that I will leave the room, and again, that has the world-to-word direction of fit, where the aim of the utterance is not to represent an independently existing reality, but get reality to change to match the propositional content of the utterance. Now, there's another interesting class that I don't have time to explain, and those are expressives, and that's where you take the fit for granted. I apologize for stepping on your foot. I thank you for giving me the money. I congratulate you on winning the race. In each case, I presuppose a fit, so I just call those, it's a rather lame expression, I just said those have a presupposed fit. All right, but now there's an amazing class of speech aids that is much more important than we are aware of, and that's where you change reality to match the content of the speech aid, but you change it by representing it as being changed. So you say, the meeting is adjourned, war is declared, I pronounce you husband and wife, you're fired, you're hired. In all of those cases, those are what I call declarations, and the purpose of a declaration is to change reality. But it changes reality by representing it as being changed. So it has the uphill direction of fit, because the world has to change to match the words, but it does it because the world is represented as being changed. The most famous examples are Austin's examples of performatives, where you perform the act of adjourning the meeting by saying the meeting is adjourned, or you perform the act of bringing about a state of war by saying war is declared. In each of those, you have a representation where you use a specific sort of verb, like a declare or adjourn, and you do that with the use of a performative verb to bring about the state of affairs represented by the performative verb by declaring it to be so changed. Furthermore, you don't actually have to have a verb. These are all over the place, these declarations. On American money, on every item of American currency, it says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. I probably have some, but I won't show them off. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Now, here's an odd fact. We're all epistemologists. We read that, and we wonder, how do they know? Have they actually done a study? Is there a survey that shows it really is legal tender? How did they discover it was legal tender? And the answer, of course, they didn't discover that. They made it the case that it was legal tender by declaring it to be the case. That utterance is a declaration. And they're all over the place, utterances like that. Now, I'm going to put forward the point of this talk, and it is the strongest claim I'm going to make, and that is all of human institutional reality is created by representations that have the form of the declaration, where you make something the case by declaring it to be the case, and there's a special category that I'm going to call status function declarations, where you make something the case of an institutional reality. You create a status function. You say, you are now a graduate of the University of Cologne, or you're a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, or you are now husband and wife, or if you like, you're now my boyfriend or my girlfriend. You make something the case by representing it as being the case, and in those cases, what you create is a status function. And I'm now going to... The central thesis of this lecture is that all of human institutional reality, the ways in which we differ from any other animal that I know about, is that we create an institutional reality by representing that reality as existing, and the form of those representations is to create status functions by declaring them to exist. So you get this interesting set of equations, and this is really the consequence of what I've been arguing for, that all institutional facts are status functions. Whether it's money, property, university degrees, marriages, cocktail parties, summer vacations, all of those are status functions. And all of those both created in their initial existence and maintained in their continuing existence by representations that have the logical form of status function declarations. I have to say representations that have a logical form because they needn't be explicit speech acts. You see, you can make somebody the boss just by treating the rest of the boss. Yes, well, we can't make a decision if Sally isn't here, or we better get Sally's voice on this before we proceed. All of those are making it the case that Sally is the boss by representing her as being the boss. So that's the first major claim of the talk, is that all of our institutional reality is created by a certain form of linguistic representation. Now that means language is not just the fundamental social institution, which it is, but that the specific form of human languages enables the creation of what we think of as the distinctive features of human civilization. See, other species have animals that have languages. The birds have different ways of communicating, and famously the bees have something that von Fritsch called the bee language. So there are all kinds of communication systems among animals, but as far as I know, we are the only species that has status function declarations, where we make something the case by representing it as being the case. Now, why do we do that? What's the point? Okay, now this is the next major thing I want to argue. The point of creating institutional facts by status function declarations is without exception to create power. All of these create power relationships. So when you acquire money, or you sell a piece of property, or you get a university degree, all of these are exchanges that create power relationships. However, the power is a very special kind of power because it's not brute physical power. Rather, it is power that is named by such words as obligation, duty, requirement, permission, authorization, and on a general term I want to use for all of those, I'm going to call those deontic powers, using the Greek notion here for duty. We create deontic powers. So you get the following equivalences. Every institutional fact is a status function. Every status function is created by and maintained in its existence by a status function declaration. And every status function is a bearer of deontic powers. Now again, how does that work? Well, this is another feature of human beings that I think in ways in which we differ from other species. The deontic powers, when accepted, lock into human rationality in a very special way. They lock into human rationality by giving us reasons for acting that are independent of our desires. They give us desire-independent reasons for acting. So our equations now have a next step. Institutional facts equal status functions created by status function declarations, status functions create deontic powers, and deontic powers provide desire-independent reasons for action. I'm sorry, this is so embarrassing. I carry this. Oh my God, it's Nicole. Well, I can't. I actually bought a book, iPhone for Dummies, but I haven't had a chance to study it. I'm still working on the critique of pure reason. In any case, we're now, as I have to tell you, we're now victims of this technology. I find I'm now regarded, at least in the United States and probably in Germany as well, as really a relic of the past, that I use effectively the technology that Aristotle had. I have this thing, but I don't use PowerPoint. Mostly I think out of vanity. I don't want people looking at something other than me, but which is what you get if you get a PowerPoint. But in any case, so here we are, and Nicole will have to wait. But, okay, so you get deontic powers that give you desire-independent reasons for action, and that is, I think, a distinctive feature of human civilization not possessed by any other species known to me. So, for example, I have had wonderful dogs. Their names are, Freda, Russell, Ludwig, Gilbert, and now Tarski. And Tarski is the most beautiful dog you ever saw. It's a Berner Sennenhund, flown in from Warsaw as a puppy, and named Tarski because he's Polish, and they're all philosophers. And I thought I cannot run around the streets of Berkeley shouting Lukashevitz or Kolakowski, but Tarski is a good enough doggy name. All right, now here's the point. Tarski is a very intelligent dog, and he responds sympathetically and sensitively to me, but he does not reflect on his obligations. He doesn't think about what it is my duty to do next. He does what he's inclined to do, and what we do when we train him is to try to make his desires match our desires, to try to make his inclinations match our inclinations. But the distinctive feature of human civilization is that we have the capacity to create, maintain, and act on reasons for action which are independent of our immediate desires and inclinations. Let me give you an example. A nice man invites me to come to Cologne and give a lecture or even a series of lectures, and when the day comes, I think, God, I'm going to go down and stand at the airport and take my shoes off and sit next to people who are trying to put their elbow where I'm trying to put my elbow on the airplane and eat airplane food and all that stuff from jet lag. And the answer is, I do it. Why? Well, I don't have to tell Germans. I made a promise. I undertook an obligation to do this. I had a commitment to do this. And that, I think, is what makes human civilization function, is we live in a sea of institutional facts that without exception are status function and without exception give us reasons for action that are independent of our inclinations. Get up in the morning and start counting the number of institutional situations in which you find yourself, with your property, your car, with the job you have in the university, with your obligations to various people, and you'll find that the distinctive feature of human civilization is the existence of status function, and the distinctive feature of status functions is they provide a remarkable form of power, the power to lock into human rationality, to give people reasons, overwhelming reasons for doing something, even in cases where they don't then and there feel like doing it. Now, how can that work if every voluntary action is the expression of a desire to perform that action? How can anybody ever act on a desire of independent reasons for action? Now, this is one of the most fascinating questions in the history of Western philosophy, and I resist the temptation to expand on it, but there are two types of answers. There's Hume's answer that says they can't. You can't act on a desire of independent reason for action. You can only act on your desires. And then there's Kant's answer, and as usual, Kant just cheated. What he says is, well, I can't tell you how pure reason can become practical, because to do that, I'd have to explain the relation between the phenomenal and the noumenal. And you think, oh my God, not again. But in any case, Kant just says the question can't be answered. So Hume says there is a question, and the answer is you can't act. You cannot act on desire or independent reasons for action. And Kant says you can, but that's a mystery. I can't tell you how, because it's the great mystery of the ding on sake. Whenever anybody says ding on sake, I reach for my gun. But anyway, it's the relation between the ding on sake and the world of phenomena, the world of assorted empirical reality. Now, I'm going to say, no, there's a remarkable fact about human rationality. And the fact is that if you recognize the validity of a desire-independent reason for action, then you have the ground for forming a desire which you did not otherwise have. And the ground for forming the desire can provide you with a desire, even though the desire then is to perform an action on the basis of a desire-independent reason. The recognition of the desire-independent reason can form the ground of a desire, which can then motivate the action. It doesn't always work. I mean, sometimes people make promises and then they just don't do it. You know? They don't feel like it, so they don't do it. But sometimes it works. And here's a simple proof that it works. Think of, we've been talking practical reason, but think of so-called theoretical reason. You have a medical result that you don't like. All the same, if it's tested, you know, they really got solid medical results, this is the diagnosis, then you have a ground for doing something that you don't otherwise want to do, namely accepting an unwelcome medical diagnosis. It's an obvious case. So it is characteristic of human rationality, and I doubt if any other animal has it, because you have to have language to have it. It's characteristic of human rationality that we can act on desire-independent reasons for action, and that is consistent with the fact that all actions, all voluntary, intentional actions, are expressions of desires to perform those actions, because the recognition of the validity of the desire-independent reason for action can provide you with a ground for forming a desire to perform that action. And that's what roughly why I'm here, and a whole lot of other things that we do. We have rational grounds for doing things that you would not otherwise be inclined to do. Now, I made another strong claim, but I want to say a little bit to justify it, and that is that not only do we create institutional reality, as I said, the reality of government, universities, and cocktail parties, and summer vacations, and Christmas holidays, all of those are created by representations that have the form of a status function declaration. But you have to maintain these things in existence, and they're maintaining their existence by repeated representations that have that form. So when Barack Obama gets up in the morning, it's tempting to think, well, he's an alpha male, and at the primate lab in any Max Planck Institute in Germany, there are a lot of primates who have alpha males as well. In Leipzig, they have a primate lab and they're alpha males, and Barack Obama's an alpha male. Huge difference. Barack Obama does not get up thinking, maybe somebody today will be a better wrestler than I am, and I'll be wrestled out of my job in the White House. He doesn't have to worry about that. His ability to arm wrestle other people in the White House is irrelevant to the status function, because we continue to represent him as the President of the United States, and that is partly constitutive of his being in that position. The continued recognition of the status function is essential to its functioning. And one of the evidences for this, I don't really have time to demonstrate this, but I can give you some evidence. Watch revolutionary movements. They want to get control of the vocabulary. When the Bolsheviks took over Russia, they insisted everybody has to be called comrade. The traditional forms of address of Tsarist Russia were abolished. Everybody had to be comrade so-and-so. And this was to reject an old set of status functions in favor of a new set of status functions. Or at a more modest level, the feminist movement in the United States was very anxious to get rid of the traditional vocabulary of ladies and gentlemen. No, it was going to be women and men. It wasn't going to be a ladies' room. There was going to be the women's room. Why does that matter? Because the vocabulary marks the status function, and they were trying to alter the status functions. It's essential to any revolutionary movement to try to get control of the vocabulary, because the status functions only exist insofar as they are represented as existing, and those representations have to continue. Watch how certain terminologies become obsolete. If you look at old American laws, the word spinster fixes prominently. So and-so is a spinster. Effectively, it meant unmarried woman, but it came from the fact that these women were supposed to be spinning cloth, were supposed to be spinning wool. Now, I once asked my class, how many of you are spinsters? And only one middle-aged woman had the courage to raise her arm. I am a spinster. Well, good for her. I wanted to give her an A on the Cato course automatically. But the point is that the word spinster has become obsolete because it marks the kind of status function that no longer exists. So the institutional structures can change dramatically, but gradually. and one of the marks is the change in the vocabulary. I wonder if the word bachelor is going the way of spinsters. Is the Pope a bachelor? I don't know. I mean, what is the correct way to describe it? But it marks a certain type of status function. Okay, I don't have time to develop this, but I want to say all of this is essential for understanding both political philosophy and ethical philosophy. Ethics is largely a matter of desire independent reasons for action. Kant was right about that. If everybody just did what they felt like, there was never any problem. We wouldn't need ethics. Animals don't have ethics in our sense. There's no system of ethics among Tarski and his playmates. Why? Well, because you can only have desire-independent reasons for action if you can represent them. Language is essential for this entire structure that I've been describing, because language is used to create and maintain all of these phenomena in existence, and you cannot act on obligations if you can't reflect on obligations, measure the force of competing obligations, resolve inconsistent obligations, and to do that, you have to have language. You have to have some way of representing the obligations. So the upshot of that part is that language isn't just one institutional structure among others, as I originally thought it was. Yes, there's this basic institution, but it's basically one institutional structure among others. No, there's a huge difference. With language, we use semantic powers to create powers that go beyond the semantics. So when we say Barack Obama is the President of the United States, and that declares him to be President, we're using the semantic power of language to create the powers of the presidency, but the powers of the presidency go far beyond semantics. You might say, well, look, it's power of language that if you say snow is white, you make the statement snow is white. It's the power of the language that if the appropriate people declare Barack Obama to be president, then he's president. What's the difference? There's a huge difference. The power of the sentence that snow is white to make the statement that snow is white is strictly semantic. The meanings of the words are enough. But the powers that the president has, though they are created by semantics, they're created by representations, they go far beyond semantics. It's not part of semantics that he can command the armed forces, but it's part of the constitutive rules that make him president. So I think understanding both ethics and the nature of political power it's essential to understand that you have to understand the structure. Now, it often puzzled me, well, why is it that traditional discussions of society, even by brilliant philosophers like Max Weber or Emil Durkheim, are so impoverished? And I think the answer is because they didn't have an adequate theory of language. They had a Mickey Mouse conception of language. They did not have a theory of speech acts. And it's kind of a scandal, going back to Aristotle, that all of the political and social theorists take language for granted. The worst offenders are the social contract theorists. They have a conception of us as running around the woods in our loincloths, speaking a language, and then suddenly we all get together and say, let's have a social contract. Let's all get together and have a social contract. Now, the message that I have been getting across, trying to get across to you is, if you've got a language, you've already got a social contract. If you have a language capable of these, and any human language is going to be capable of those, then you've got a social contract, because they are what creates institutional reality. So, all right, what I've done then is try to give you a sketch of the underlying structure of the distinctly human features of human civilization. And if I'm right, then what is special about humans? Now, I'm not knocking other species. You know, if it turns out there's a primate tribe that also has money and government and income tax and private property and national elections, fine. Welcome to the club. I'm not here putting down other species, but I'm going to say the distinctive feature of human reality, of human social reality, is our remarkable capacity to create incredibly complex social structures with stability and persistence through long periods of time. And it is the single linguistic mechanism is applied over and over in the creation of these structures, even though the structures vary enormously, all the way from love affairs to national elections. They all have this structure, and I think this will provide us with a lot of material for further investigation. Thank you very much.
You just said that there's a big difference between the sentences "Snow is white" and Barack Obama's the President of the United States of America. Isn't the sentence "Barack Obama is the President of the United States of America" just the beginning of a big chain of other sentences that have their own semantics? So
yeah. Okay, now this is a very deep question, and I didn't really expand on that enough. The point is this: if I am right, all of human institutional reality, with the elaborate structures of power, are created by representations, and with very few exceptions, those are linguistic representations. Sometimes you can do it with gestures and so on, but for the most part, they're linguistic representations. Now, when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court says, "I now declare you President of the United States," I don't know what he says, but let's do something like that. "I now declare you President of the United States." How is that different from I now assert that snow is white by saying snow is white? And what I'm saying, the powers of the sentence "snow is white" are strictly part of the semantics of English. If you know the meaning of the sentence, you know that those powers are already contained in that meaning. Knowing the meaning of the sentence gives you the power to make a statement with that sentence. But the sentence, "You are President of the United States," or "I declare you President of the United States," that sentence by itself doesn't convey the power. The power has to be conveyed by this apparatus of collective acceptance of a status function. And it is, if you think about it, it's a good idea to allow yourself to be amazed by what other people just take for granted. It is amazed by the extent to which people just recognize, yes, well, he has the power. People who hate him with a passion still accept that he has these powers, and the powers are quite enormous. And they are created by semantics, but they go beyond semantics. This is the point. Language is not just one institution among others. It is the institution that is presupposed by all of the others. But what we then do is use language, use the semantic powers of language to create powers that go far beyond semantics. So private property, government, money, marriage, all of those contain powers that go far beyond the semantic.
Desires that people have.
Yeah.
First, is the acceptance of ideas in a certain society related, in your opinion, by those desires?
I'm not sure I understood the question, so I'll answer it, and you tell me how I misunderstood it. You see, the remarkable thing about human beings is they can create reasons for action and act on those reasons for reasons that are independent of the desire. By recognizing, Nietzsche understood this when he said the remarkable thing about human beings is they can make promises. That's a stunning achievement. And I want to say that the promise is typical of a whole range of representations where we create this desire independent reasons for action. Then you have a puzzle. And the puzzle is, well, you don't do anything unless in some sense you want to do it. And then how can it be the case that you can act intentionally on a desire where the desire is a desire independent reason for action? And the answer I gave to that is to say that rationality can use the recognition of the desire independent reason for the formation of a desire. I don't know if that answers your question, so you may want to try it again.
Well, so what I asked is that, let's talk an example. There are some ideas that are treated in some communities as boring, and I would like to ask that this boringness, where does it come from?
What's the word? Where does what come from?
Boring. So not interesting.
As in being bored? Yeah, boredom is pervasive. You don't require institutions. I was interested in those institutional facts where you can't have a fact without the institution. You can't have private property or government. But boredom comes free. You don't need an institution for being bored.
This is another point when declaring another situation. So that is, in your opinion, another point than the institution.
Well, not all facts are institutional facts. I mean, if you have a stomach ache or you are drinking your beer, those are not institutional facts. Now, you buy the beer, okay, then that's institutional. And you got a stomach ache by buying and eating a restaurant meal, that requires an institution. But of course, the typical function of institutional facts is to create and regulate facts that are not institutional. I do a lot of it with credit cards, and there are various institutional adjustments are made on computers, and the result is I get on an airplane and fly to Germany. That's not an institutional fact. That's a group fact, a group change in my physical location from one continent to another. So I don't want to give the idea that, well, there's one class of facts over here, those are group facts, and the institutional facts are over here. No, the whole point of institutions is typically to regulate group facts and create new group facts relation. If it's my car, then I have the power to engage in certain group facts. I can start it and drive it away. And that's the fact that it's my car enables me to do that.
You mentioned the alpha male in Leipzig. I would like to ask you about what you think. So that alpha male in Leipzig, he also has a status, right? And he might have won several battles with other chimpanzees. And so the status is being endowed by him, maybe not by speech acts, but by the behavior of other his fellow animals. So isn't that an example of
what's the
status also has one?
Okay, if you have a set of animals and they have hierarchical structures, it's tempting to describe those as status hierarchies. You know, here's the alpha male and the alpha female and the beta male and the gamma male and so on. Now, but they're quite different from the stuff that I've been describing, though to ethologists they look quite similar. So Barack Obama's an alpha male and that primate over here is an alpha male. The situation of the alpha male is created and maintained by physical power. See, if you go look at Mike Tomasello's primate lab at the Max Planck Institute, and I've been visiting him in Leipzig, each day the alpha male has to suffer the possibility that he'll be overthrown as alpha male, and it's brute force that does the job. This is why the alpha male has to be allied with other males, and he has allies, he has friends who help him out in his battle for the maintenance of the position. But the position carries no deontology. Nobody says, I am under an obligation to recognize the primacy of the alpha male. It's just prudence, it's just prudential. have to do that, otherwise you get beat up. So the remarkable thing about human beings is their ability to create and act on incredibly complex structures, where the structure gives people reasons for action that are not potential, that go beyond their desires and the means for satisfying their desires.
We do realize that language is a very powerful instrument, a very powerful tool. Can you
Yeah.
Yes. Cultural context, because this is more specific to one language group, isn't it? The European Union and the United States are nations who have been a total mess all the time, if there isn't something else in between.
Yeah. Well, there is the problem of translating from one language to another, but for the most part, the phenomena that I have been discussing are rather easily translated from one language to another. Now, the language does incorporate a mode of sensibility and a set of values, and that doesn't always translate from one language to another. The history of the Nazis' abuse of German is quite remarkable, and there's a kind of mind-numbing use of language where they repeat things over and over. Sprich Deutsch, denk Deutsch, sei Deutsch. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. I'm going to go through the whole litany of these. And these are designed precisely to inhibit critical thinking. You're supposed to just become part of this rhythmic movement of the language. And this is not the kind of language that I'm trying to analyze here. What I'm trying to analyze is where we create a set of powers by representing the powers as existing. But those powers continue to exist only insofar as they are recognized. And that typically does translate from one language to another. So, for example, I arrive in Europe with American currency, but it's readily converted. The exchange rate's not so good anymore, but it's readily converted into euros. And the one message in this lecture is the primacy of language. And then there's an interesting question that you're raising, and that is, but don't languages differ? And they do. And it'd be very interesting, for example, I have a friend who studies a tribe in the Amazon basin called the Piraha. His name's Dan Everett. And they have very little institutional structure. They have minimal private property and no real form of government, and they have their language doesn't have the resources of our language. They have no color words. They can't count. They can't do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the language that he has discovered is inconsistent with the standard Chomskyan account of what languages have to be like. They have no recursive rules. So you can't say, I met the man who knew my mother. You have to say, I met the man who knew my mother. You cannot use relative clauses in Piraha. Now, this is in dispute. A lot of people challenge his understanding, but on the other hand, he understands Piraha better than anybody else ever has, because he lived with those people for 30 years. And they really do have a radically different kind of culture from ours. Now, we're forbidden to say, by political correctness, we can't say their language is more primitive, but it seems to me obvious that it is. They cannot count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They have no color words. They can't say it's red. They say, well, it looks like blood. And Dan had a beautiful proof that the standard anthropologist translation, that really they have 1, 2, many. That's how they count. He did it by going backwards. Take 10 objects. You do 1, that's 1, 2, 2, that's 2, and any one of that is many. Take 10 objects, that's many, 9, 8, and then they say 2, you see. So it was mistranslated as 2. It meant 1 more, lots more. And so you have to be careful how you map their language on our language, because it's easy to make certain systematic mistakes. But I guess the message I want to leave you with is we need a much greater sensitivity to the role of language in the creation and maintenance of power, particularly human institutions. Now there is a form of power that is stunning, and I simply do not understand it, and that is, why on earth is there this total obsession that goes on, especially in Europe and North America, but it's now spread worldwide, with the nation state as the ultimate expression of institutional loyalty. And I'm as much a victim of as anybody. I wouldn't die for Alameda County. Okay, I mean, I live in Alameda County. It's important to me that if somebody says, we're all going to fight and die for Alameda County, forget it. I'm not going to. But the United States of America, that's different. I mean, my son is a lieutenant colonel in the Green Berets. And we have, in our family, we have a different attitude toward the United States of America than what we have toward Alameda County. But it is an amazing fact that this absurd institution, the nation state, became, and I guess it started with Louis XIV, I don't know when it actually began, but it's fairly recent, it became the ultimate institutional focus of loyalty. It became the ultimate source of desire, independent reasons for action, and in many cases it trumped religion. It was more important than religion, with catastrophic effects.
May I add a question? Picking up the last example, why dying for X and not for Y, and also coming back to your qualification of the Nazi language and vocabulary. Here it was not only describing a phenomenon, how language was used, but you were making a judgment of a language, for example, taking away the freedom of thinking. So, I will ask you especially in this, because your picture you were giving of building up a social practice is more or less given in an affirmative way. So we just act this way. We are able to translate. But what is when you indeed act in order not to understand the other, to exclude the other, to use a language which, for example, takes away the freedom of thinking. How this fits into your, this is a point where in traditional theories, and you were a little bit critical at the end with all those theories from Kant to Hobbes and so on, some thing of a natural state of human nature. Let me just give you this imagination. Fits in, and we are referring to this maybe as an intrinsic value which has to be predominant to our use of language and imposing rules and laws.
Well, it's interesting to see how political and social theory have changed. There was a time when appeals to human nature were quite common, and then in recent generations that became illegitimate. You're not supposed to appeal to human nature, but at a certain level, I think you have to. You have to say that human beings differ from certain other species, even primate species, in that they have these structures and they don't. Now that's not like traditional appeals to human nature, but I want to recognize that there's a biological basis for all of this, and that human language does things which the bee language and the way that the primates have of communicating with each other doesn't do. And then many of these slogans, Nazi slogans, were designed not to report a reality, but to create it. Du bist nicht dein Volk ist alles. And so on. I won't go through the whole litany, but it's fascinating to people who are interested in the philosophy of language, because language was being used to create a new social reality.
We just could hear that language is a very powerful tool to create, let's say, new realities. What do you think about non-phonetic language, such as arts and music?
Yeah.
Are they able to serve as such powerful tools too?
Yeah. Well, the part of the problem with our obsession with language is the word language is used metaphorically for all kinds of things that are not strictly speaking languages. Now, why isn't music a language? Well, roughly speaking, because it doesn't represent. There are representational passages in Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. There is there's a part that represents the peasant dances and then the rain coming, but that's unusual. Most music is non-representational. There's no question of the direction of fit in the case of music. Now, the problem with the notion of art is that it's come to mean almost anything. See, a friend of mine, Arthur Danto, writes books about art, and he asks the question, what is art? And he gives the depressing answer, anything. Well, I don't really think that. I mean, I think that we have to have a more narrow... I think my shoestrings are not art. I could make them into a work of art. I will not bore you, to use the other example, with a demonstration of that. So what is the right way? Well, I think there are two things to remember. One is everything in our experience has an aesthetic dimension. Everything. The meal, the view from your window, the walk down the street, all experiences for human beings have an aesthetic dimension. I don't think that's true even for my dog Darcy. But now then, there's a special class of aesthetic dimension, namely the aesthetic dimension that consists in recognizing other people's intentionality as the source of the aesthetic experience. The limiting case is the objet d'art, when you just find a stone and say this is a beautiful stone. But then even that is the recognition of the stone as involving somebody else's intentionality towards it. So, but I think, roughly speaking, with music we have a fairly well-defined notion of what is music. With art as such, it's just too broad. There are representational forms of art, but they're now no longer in the visual arts. They're no longer predominating in contemporary art. There have been forms of art that are used for representations of this kind and actually function in creating social reality. So you think of Christian art. Early Christian art was not designed as a celebration for the artists. Most of those works of art were anonymous. They're anonymous representations of religious scenes, and they are designed through the representation of the religious scene to encourage further adherence to the faith, to strengthen the faith. But for this kind of stuff, you've got to have more than pictures. You cannot create a Constitution of the United States or even the laws creating the IBM Corporation just by drawing pictures or playing music.
For example, when watching the Super Bowl, when you see then the American hymn is performed, the entire stadium raises up, and I think this stands for something. It's not meaningless.
All right.
And it constitutes the nation at this time.
Okay.
And boy, if you make a mistake, then you are really out.
Right. Okay, now this is a good example, because the expression of the institution requires continuous representation in order to continue to exist. Now, for the nation state, the form of the expression has to be an expression, it's almost like a religion, it's an expression of faith and support in the nation state, and that is done with things like the national anthem. I once went to a Super Bowl in Stanford Stadium, and it occurred to me, if anthropologists, say 200 years from now, could watch a film of this from beginning to end, and they knew nothing else about it, they would be bound to misunderstand it. They would say, first of all, it has to be a religious ceremony. Nobody will spend this amount of effort, this amount of money, this incredible accoutrement of music and cheering and supporting just for a game. So it must have some deep religious significance. And furthermore, it's not hard to identify the religious significance because the names of the the priests were symbolic. The chief priest of the red and white team was Montana, Joe Montana. All right, we all know what Montana means. It means mountain. The Freudian symbolism is painfully obvious. Made more excruciatingly so by the fact that the chief priest of the other group of priests was Marino, Dan Marino. And you all know what Marino means. The Freudian symbolism now becomes possibly embarrassing because the male symbol on a mountain is confronted in orgiastic unity with the female symbol of the sea. The mountain and the sea come together. We know who has to triumph. The male symbol triumphs, and it indeed happened. The San Francisco 49ers, led by Joe Montana, beat Dan Marino and Miami Dolphins. I forget the score. There was jubilation in San Francisco. Now, it's very hard to understand another culture, and I don't know how future generations would understand this, because it looks like much more is going on here than just a football game, and I think that's what we're about. But I think the anthropological version that I gave is a parallel. It shows the impoverished character of our categories for describing these phenomena.
Yeah, here.
This, achieve.
Would you admit that the process of globalization can eventually lead to the creation of sort of new ultimate human agreement? And
Yeah.
what could it look like?
Yeah, well, okay, I said that the most bizarre phenomenon in institutional structures is the incredible power of the nation state. There's nothing like it in the ancient world. Maybe Rome, I don't know, but certainly not the Greek city-states did not have that type of power. And the temptation is always to think, well, let's transcend that. Let us get a focus of loyalty, which is truly universal. Why can't there be a universal nation state? Well, it turns out it's harder to do that than we thought. It looked like it would be relatively easy. In Europe, yeah, they all share the same culture, and they all live in the same little bitty countries. You know, there's no big country like China or Russia or the United States. But it turns out even that's hard. They tried to get a currency before they had a common central bank with a common sovereign, and it's not working out so well. So I don't see an immediate future for a universal nation state. Well, a universal state, I mean, the whole idea of a nation it's a cultural notion. And the problem is most cultures define themselves by opposition. That is to say, you define the in-group by who is the out-group. You define us as against them. So it is we Quebecois against these dreadful Anglophones. And without the Anglophones, you would not have the loyalty that the Quebecois are capable of attracting. Now, I don't have to tell you that the history of Europe is like that. The history of Europe is individual nation states defining themselves in opposition to competing nation states. And whether or not we will ever transcend that and get a truly international focus of loyalty, it certainly hasn't happened with the United Nations.
How important are the truth values of declarations, and what truth conditions do the declarations have? Is the sentence "war is declared" creating its own truth value?
Yeah. What happens in the case of the declaration is that you make the sentence true by declaring it to be true, or that is to say, strictly speaking, by declaring the state of affairs that it represents as existing. Now, the simplest cases of this are performative utterances, and the simplest case of those are linguistic declarations, where you say, I promise to come and see you. Now, that makes it the case that I promise to come and see you by representing it as being the case. Now, language is enough for that, but when you get to more elaborate forms, I now States is hereby declared, then you require more than just language. Then you require institutional structure that goes beyond language. It's very interesting to see how the United States declares war. They always repeat the same locution. And I think what they do is they send a secretary to the files and she digs out the last time we declared war, and they copy the same words. So they use the same word. And the other thing is, most wars we get involved in are not actually declared, because when you declare a war officially, all kinds of institutional powers come into play that they don't want. They want flexibility, so the president can fight wars without an actual declaration of war. We had no declaration of war in Afghanistan, and yet we continue to fight there. But if you have a declaration of war, then the war continues until you have a peace treaty. So we were at war with Germany, as legally speaking, long after 1945, because there had been a declaration of war at the end of 1941. So these are special cases where you have an elaborate legal and institutional structure surrounding the performative. It's a performative, we hereby declare war, but it carries with it a lot of other institutional and legal structure beyond just the semantic structure.
Thank you. On an abstract level, at what points would you say is your theory taking Austin's theory of speech act further, and why?
Well, Austin really was the inventor of the theory of speech acts, but he never really had a version of it that was publishable. He died quite suddenly at what now seems to be an absurdly early age of 48. And what we read in Austin are effectively what I have in my lecture notes going to his classes. So I don't think he ever saw that there was this implication of the theory of performance, but I think he would have welcomed it. He would see that, yes, this is a good example of how performative utterances can be used to create a reality that goes beyond the reality of the linguistic semantics, and that's really what I'm trying to describe. Now, the point is, performative utterances are a rather restricted class. Those are the cases where you use a performative verb. War is hereby declared. The meeting is adjourned. I now pronounce you husband and wife. That's a very restricted class. You don't encounter many of those in daily life. But these status function declarations, where you create a reality by representing it as existing. You see, look at the Nazis again. They were not trying to describe an existing reality. They were trying to get you to conform to a certain conception that they had. Du bist nicht sein Volkes alles. Ein Volk, ein someone. All these things were designed to create